Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is super best-selling author Lisa See. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you back in Tulsa again, and now as this hugely successful author. Did you ever think you would have this kind of monumental success?
Never in a million years.
Really?
Never in a million years. Somebody actually last night, I was doing an event, asked, in the Q&A, did you ever, what did you think when you became a New York Times #1 bestseller? And the thing is, I never even imagined it. It wasn't even something I dreamed of, because I just didn't think that was something that ever could happen to anybody I knew, let alone to me. So it's just, some of it is just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable to me.
Well, it is. And your memoir on Gold Mountain has been reissued.
Mm-hmm.
When did you know that you needed to write that book? At what stage of your life?
Well, I was, let's see, I guess I was about 35 when I started working on it. And someone had called me and wanted to include my family in a book she was doing on prominent Chinese American families. And I called my great aunt, and as always, she said, oh no, we don't participate in things like that. 2 years later, that book came out on the eve of my great aunt's birthday, and I gave it to her, and the next day she called and she said, I realized I made a mistake. Why don't you come over and I'll tell you some stories too. And that first day I learned things I had never heard before. My great-grandfather had 4 wives, not 2, what I'd always heard, and that there had been this kidnapping. And I had never heard about the kidnapping, and it took another 2 years for me to get the story of that. But what happened was about 3 months into interviewing my aunt, she died very suddenly. And at her funeral, which was a big traditional Chinese funeral with this big banquet, people started coming up to me and saying, we know Auntie Sissy was talking to you. Why don't you come over and we'll tell our stories too? And I think actually that if she hadn't died when she did, that I probably never would have written the book. It was like this kind of gift that she gave me that then everyone in the family chose to honor.
Well, and if you hadn't written the book, you couldn't have asked these kinds of questions of your family, could you?
No, never. Never.
And even at that, Lisa, were there times that you learned more than you wanted to know?
Well, there were because actually I think all of it is interesting to know.
Oh, it's fascinating.
All of it is interesting, but there are things that when you're talking to people, they'll say, oh, I don't remember, and you have to go through this long process. And as I mentioned earlier, the kidnapping went through a long 2 years before I could actually get the people to talk to me about it. And I remember this so clearly, sitting with my great uncle Akun, about 90 at that time, and we sat next to each other on this little love seat with this little bowl of peanuts between us, staring straight ahead, and he told this story, something he had never told before. And it was so painful for him and very painful to hear, but I felt so honored that he finally could tell someone, after 90 years, he could finally tell somebody. And I believe that my family, even though I'm sure there was a lot of it that was kind of shocking, that they felt like, okay, this happened, and that it was acknowledged in a way that it had never been before.
You think it was cathartic?
I do think it was.
For them and for you?
Yeah, well, I don't know about for me, but it was for them. And I know my grandma, for example, my grandfather had a lot of affairs, and there's a part in there about one of these affairs, and she would open the book, she'd see one, look, see where Eddie had that affair? She wanted everyone to know, there it was. She, now everybody could know about it.
It's documented, it's
validated.
Yeah, it was
documented, and, she was vindicated and all like that. So she was pretty funny about it.
I wonder if you might speak to the role American women have played in the cultural integration of your Chinese family.
Well, my great-grandfather, came from China. He became the kind of godfather patriarch of Los Angeles Chinatown. And he had 4 wives. One was a Caucasian woman. You know, in California, it was against the law for Chinese and Caucasians to marry down to a quarter Chinese until 1948. In other states, till 1965. Most of them in the West. My grandmother, when she married my grandfather, they had to go to Mexico to get married. It was still against the law. My own parents were only the second couple in our whole extended family to be married legally in the United States. And I think what united these women, very, very different on the surface, was that in each way they were kind of orphaned. My great-grandmother, truly an orphan, my grandmother, who had been orphaned by circumstance, and my mother, who had parents but was on her own, completely on her own from the time she was 17. And I think all of them saw this very traditional Chinese family, a true family, and you know, kind of went in and hung on and saw something that they didn't have and couldn't have otherwise.
I think one of the most powerful voices in the memoir, and that's saying a lot because there are many powerful voices, belongs to Anna May Wong. I mean, this historic, iconic actress. You literally have her speak from the dead. Why was it important for you to give her that kind of platform?
So she was my grandfather's, one of his closest friends. I have some of her clothes in my closet.
Kidding, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so jealous.
Just, you know, and I kept trying to talk to her brother, Richard, and we'd set up an appointment to meet, and he would then cancel it. And we'd do another one, he'd cancel it. We'd do it another one, he'd cancel it. And after truly 3 or 4 years of that, one day he called me and he said, you know, I need to cancel, and you know, I just don't think I want to participate in something like that. And they had in her family, you know, a lot of shame and embarrassment about her. You know, in the Chinese culture, actors are seen, and women especially, you know, it's just like this high above being a prostitute, very low, seen to be very low. And I think Anna May is someone also who, even though she was successful, and even today, still probably the most successful Chinese American actress, many of her parts were very stereotypical. You know, the China doll, the temptress, the dragon lady, all of those things. So I think there was personal shame in the family, but also shame for the stereotype that she had created, or helped to create. And so I got off the phone, I remember this so clearly, and thinking, you don't want to participate? You don't want to, what does that even mean? And I just kind of heard Anna May speaking in my mind, you know, of nobody asked her. You know, that was, I just thought, nobody asked her. And that's the first sentence of that chapter. No one asked me what I thought. And that to go from her position. And I was able to find things that she had written that throughout her time in Hollywood that talked about how she felt when the Japanese invaded China, what it felt like for her to go to China, where they treated her very, very poorly, when she left the United States, when she couldn't get work here and went to Europe to work. You know, she had a very difficult life and a very difficult career as well. And so this just gave me a place for her to say, no one asked me what I thought, but now I'm going to tell you. And I was able to use her own words to do it.
And we also have to talk about the title of the book, On Gold Mountain. What are the myths and realities of On Gold Mountain?
So Gold Mountain was the Chinese name for the United States. And I think many, many immigrant groups, of course, look at the United States. You know, they think, oh, you'll come here and you'll find pieces of gold the size of babies, and, you know, this kind of fantasy that all of, from around the world, you know, that immigrants have about what will happen when you come here. All your dreams will come true, that you'll find wealth, you'll find gold. And so that was part of the Chinese mystique, but it's also the actual name for the United States. And so when they came, of course, it was not that, you know, didn't work out in such a happy way for so many immigrants. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act and all of the different laws that were, again, particularly in the West, but some of them national. You know, Chinese couldn't become naturalized citizens until 1943. That's very recent. I mean, it seems recent to me.
Well, it
So
is.
it's and most people don't even know that. Don't have that awareness that there was a group of people who were not allowed naturalization.
It's been 17 years since you wrote this book. To what extent has it been the start of a larger conversation with you and your family, with you and the world at large?
Yeah, so I've just written this new afterword.
Oh,
And I
yeah,
found
yeah.
some new material.
Yeah.
And I don't go back and read my books. Why? When you write them,
You know what happens.
you know what happens. You've been through them 20, 30 times already. But because I was writing this afterward, I had to go back and look at a lot of things, look up certain dates. But I had used an aphorism, not an aphorism, a quote from Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose as the epigraph for On Gold Mountain. And I don't remember it exactly, but it's something like, "Fooling around in the papers my grandmother left behind, I get glimpses of lives that are close to mine. I wish I could live in their clothes for a while." And when I saw that, it's now about a year ago, and when I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, that is what I was doing with On Gold Mountain, but that's really what I've been doing with every book since. This idea of stepping into somebody else's clothes, looking at their papers, and just trying to live, if not in their clothes, to be in the room with them at these different moments of history.
And of course, you've gone on to write several bestsellers. Was it important that you wrote On Gold Mountain first?
I don't know, because I don't know what would have happened if I'd written something else first. But I would say probably yes, because I have written about China and the Chinese-American experience, and yet look at me. On the surface, it doesn't look like it makes any sense that I would. And
you're an eighth?
I'm an eighth. But in Los Angeles, I have about 400 relatives. There are about a dozen that look like me, the majority still full Chinese, and then this little spectrum in between. So, I grew up in this truly large Chinese-American family. So even though I look like this, what your mirror is the people who are around you. They're the ones who tell you who you are. So that's what I really thought I was in many ways, and that was the culture I was brought up in. I lived with my mom, but I spent so much time with my father's side of the family, which again was so gigantic.
And down at the store,
Down
which was
at the family
was a
store.
meeting place for
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah.
What was it like being in that store? I wanted to go to that store so
Well,
much.
it's still there, so if
Is
you
it?
come to Los Angeles, I'll take you there.
Wait, you promise?
Oh, absolutely.
I would love to.
Yeah.
I fell in love with the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's now one of the oldest continuously run family-owned businesses in the state. It started as an herbal shop by my great-great-grandfather, then curios and then antiques, and it's been there in California since about 1871, 72, somewhere in there. So, it's big. It's very, very big. And it has this big central aisle, and then these little rooms along the side that have, one is the room for textiles, scrolls, ceramics, bronzes, jewelry. It's very beautiful and has this incredible smell, but there's also big, big stuff, because when my great-grandparents would go to China, starting in about 1901, they would go into villages and they'd say things like, "Oh, we like your temple, we'll buy it." And then they'd buy it, they'd take it apart, stick it on a sampan, send it down the river, load it on a boat, bring it here, put it all back together, and then never ever sell it. This is a very interesting way my family has of doing business. Never sell anything. But one thing they have done with that stuff is they've rented it to the movie
It's a
industry.
fascinating story about all of that. Let's talk about the Red Princess mysteries.
Oh, they're so fun. So,
Contemporary, but still rooted in tradition,
right,
Chinese tradition.
absolutely, yeah. These are a series of mysteries that have an American attorney who bears a striking resemblance to my own husband, but he's a little bit dumber, and then a woman who works for the Ministry of Public Security in China, which is sort of China's version of the FBI. And these two people work together on these various cases that take them around China. Again, very, very contemporary, but always have some piece of history in the background that takes place today, but you might learn a bit about the origins of the Chinese language or Chinese herbal medicine, or the things that are in the past that still have an impact today.
In your next two novels, you reach back in history again, and I'd like your quick take on Snowflower and the Secret Fan.
Mm-hmm. So this I started when I had come across the secret writing system that was invented by women, used by women, and kept a secret by women in one very, very remote county in China for 1,000 years. And when I read that, when I first came across it, I just thought, how could this exist? And I didn't know.
Well, sure.
And then how could this exist and we all didn't know, especially women. Because so often we hear about women in the past. No women writers, no women historians, no women chefs, no women, there were women, but supposedly they didn't do anything. But, of course women had done things. And this was something that they had done, the only writing system to have been found anywhere in the world used exclusively by women. A remarkable discovery. And yet somehow we don't know, hadn't known about it. And I just wanted to write about the sort of culture of that language, which had at its center these two different kinds of relationships. One was a sworn sisterhood, several girls together, and then the other one was what was called a laotong, old same relationship, where two girls at about age 5 were matched. They signed a contract, almost like they were signing a marriage contract. But this allowed them, they would still get married, but this would allow them to write to each other in the secret language throughout the course of their lives. And so even though they were not allowed to visit very often, and even though they had bound feet and were, isolated in what was called the upstairs chamber, a room upstairs in the house, their entire lives, from the time they were 5 until they died, this secret language allowed them, in a sense, to fly out of the window and reach across the fields and find other women who would listen to them, with whom they could share their stories.
And Peony in Love.
Peony in Love. So Peony in Love is sort of an interesting one. It's also based on a true story. In the 17th century in China, in the Yangtze Delta, there were over 1,000 women writers who were writing and being published. They were traveling around the country in the 17th century version of book tours. They were supporting their families with their writing. There was a subcategory of these women called the lovesick maidens, and they loved an opera called The Peony Pavilion. Never allowed to see it, but they could read it. And when they read it, they would catch cases of lovesickness, like the main character in the opera, and then waste away and die. And as they were dying, they would write poems and stories, which were then published after their deaths. Those things you can still read today. If you went to the library and you pulled out a book of Chinese poetry, you would still be able to read some of the things written by these lovesick maidens. And
It's
so,
incredible.
yeah, it is incredible, because no one in the West, no women in the West were writing in that time, and that was still available to read. And so I've written it actually as a kind of a ghost story. So it's about the lovesick maidens, but it's also a bit of a Chinese ghost story.
And then your most recent books are companion books,
Yeah.
in a way. We have Shanghai Girls and just out, Dreams of Joy, just
Right.
out in paperback. Tell us a little bit about May and Pearl and this
yeah.
wonderful sisterhood.
So May and Pearl are our sisters. They were what were called beautiful girls, these young women in Shanghai who posed for advertising posters. And these posters, they're called beautiful girls for a reason. They have these lovely complexions and beautiful hair, and they're always in their, gorgeous boudoirs. They were trying to sell this idea of a new modern Chinese woman. And so this is what happens to these two sisters who actually have to flee out of China and come to the United States as immigrants. And to me, this Shanghai Girls is really about home. What is home? At what point? It's an immigrant story. What is home? What do we leave behind? What do we bring here? We all have someone in our families, somewhere along the line, who was scared enough, brave enough, crazy enough,
To
to leave their home country to come here. We all share in that. And at what point do we then become American? You know, it doesn't happen overnight. What do we bring? What do we leave behind? And then with Dreams of Joy, Pearl, the older sister, and then her daughter, Joy, go back to China. And this is when China has already closed. China was closed until President Nixon opened it, but it turns out it wasn't quite as closed as we all believed, because there were a lot of people going in and a lot of people going out in those days. And so at the heart of Dreams of Joy is a mother-daughter story. And I think if you look at all of my books, you know, going all the way back to On Gold Mountain, there are these women who are incredible mothers, you know, and I think there are the bad mothers out there. We all know about those mothers. But there are also these mothers who will sacrifice anything to make sure that their children are safe, happy, healthy, alive, that sometimes it takes extraordinary courage to make that happen, and that there's also no one more loyal to you than your own mother. So this idea of motherhood and mother love, which in Chinese is a particular written character for mother love, which combines two elements. One part means love, the other part means pain, that's a mother's love. And so that, I think, is actually, you know, if you looked over all 8 books, that's right there at the heart of all of them.
In The Shanghai Girls, Pearl tells the story, and we only hear from May indirectly, and just barely at that. How important is her voice to the story?
Well, actually, what I love about Shanghai Girls is that it really is told from Pearl's point of view, and she is, you know, one of those classic unreliable narrators. You know, you're kind of going along, you believe anything she'll say, and then at the end, May comes in, and you realize, oh, she's had a very different opinion about everything that happened. And actually, when I was writing, you know, well, I'll just say 2 things. First, you know, in families how you could be 2 sisters, same house, same family, you see things very differently. You could be at the same Thanksgiving dinner, tomorrow morning you're going to see things differently of what happened. And so as I was writing, I kept next to the computer a piece of paper where I would write, as I was writing, I would write down every single place where I thought May would have a different opinion of what had happened. Some of them were tiny, you know, little things. Some were huge, but that happens in an argument. You know, when you get one of those really huge blowout arguments, there's the big thing, but there's also that list of every wrong that you feel that has happened for the last 20 years. And so Pearl is May is kind of able to pull out that list. She doesn't use everything that I wrote down, but she does have those things. Some very, very important, some kind of insignificant. And the thing is, what I found from readers is that they say, oh, you know, it's such a surprise at the end how May saw so much differently. But in fact, she's there throughout, saying exactly what she thinks. But because Pearl is telling the story, it's really filtered through Pearl's eyes and Pearl's experience and Pearl's heart, so that it's not may not be the exact truth. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does, exactly. I think that's the more honest way to approach storytelling. But I'm thinking of that terrible flight scene as they leave. Was that hard for you to write? I mean, I was rereading it last night, and it brought tears to my eyes. What happened to the mother? We don't want to give too much away. But when you're writing something like that, Lisa, is it hard to pull back from it?
It's hard to go to it.
Is it?
Is really, you know, when I wake up in the morning, I don't think, oh, goody, you know.
No.
I mean, it's very hard. It's very hard to go there. I think harder for me to go there than to get out of it. Those 17th century women writers that I was mentioning, they had a kind of philosophy about what you needed to do as a writer, which was you have to cut to the bone. And that idea of cutting to the bone, you know, that has really stuck with me. And of course, that isn't easy. You know, it's hard. It's just very hard. So there are things that I know, you know, because I do a lot of plotting, and so I'll know what's coming. And sometimes I'll start to slow down because I know what's coming. coming.
Yeah,
and,
I can
and
imagine.
I just know that I have to go there, and it is very hard for me. It's very hard.
And even some of the things that aren't quite as dramatic, with the foot binding. I mean, very hard to accept that,
Yeah.
and you feel such great sympathy. And then in the new book, we have another character, Joy. What intrigues you most about Joy?
One of the things that I like about Joy, she's 19. She's idealistic, but let's just be frank, a bit stupid.
Well, it
she's
happens.
naive.
It happens.
And impetuous, like a lot, I wouldn't want to mention any names, but I may have been like that too at that age, that where you just sort of do something where you're not really thinking about the consequences. And the thing that I like the most, I think, about the novel as a whole is that you know how in some stories, or even if you watch an episode of Law and Order, something happens, but by the end of the hour everything is fixed. In real life, that's when at the end of that hour, that's when things really are starting to happen. That's when all of those terrible things, whatever's happened, now you have to live with it for the rest of your life. And you can make a mistake, in television world or in many novels or movies, and it will get fixed very quickly. In real life, you make a mistake, and maybe you can fix it, but maybe that leads you to another mistake, which leads you to another mistake. And every time you have a choice, you might make the wrong choice. And so Joy, unfortunately, even though she's smart, even though she's beautiful, even though she is filled, and maybe perhaps because she's filled with idealism, she makes one bad decision after another. And then how she gets out of it, to me, is what is really interesting, about that story, and how she grows up along the way.
Well, congratulations on a beautiful book, on a beautiful career. Thank you for being here,
Thank
Lisa.
you.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.